Secondly, it's not just a crisis of underconsumption, it's also going to exacerbate inequalities. Because as I said, you've got these uniquely human skills are getting ever smaller. Now, if we try and understand automation in a single sentence, what does automation do to the labour market? What does it do to jobs? Anything which is repetitive can be potentially automated. Okay? Whether it's the production of a screw, or whether it's cardiac heart surgery, or whether you're a radiologist, or whether you're a taxi driver. Anything which is repetitive potentially can be automated. Now, this process is obviously not new. It's been going on, arguably, for centuries. In fact, if you read The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, the neoclassical economist, he talks about how labour competing and contesting against capital has basically been the base for all technological innovation ever. Sadly, most capitalists, most people in the establishment don't really read their Adam Smith, despite naming think tanks after him. It's a shame. He's a smart guy. And if you've heard about automation before, and you've heard about something called the Luddite fallacy, which says basically, look, I'm going to get rid of this. We've heard this so many times before. The Luddites, you may have heard of the Luddites. Hands up who's heard of the Luddites in here. That's really good. So the Luddites were in the 1810s. Basically, they were weavers, they were workers outside the factory, and their jobs were being automated at an amazing rate in places like Derbyshire, Nottinghamshire, basically around the Midlands. And they decide this technology, this automation, isn't in their interest. So they start destroying things like the spinning jenny, etc., etc. And they had reason to do so, because we know, looking back, from the 1800s, early 1800s, all the way through really to 1848, while there were massive increases in productivity, this didn't feed through to higher wages for people, right? I think it's called the Engels pause. So when people look back and they say, well, we had the 1848 revolutions, we had the emergence of working class consciousness and workers' movements in the first half of the 19th century, that was a reasonable, rational thing to do, because increases in productivity weren't feeding through to better standards of living. But they did, didn't they? In the second half of the 19th century, in the 20th century, clearly, we're socialists, but nobody's going to say that life was better in the early 1800s than it was today for the average person in Britain, by and large. So what the Luddite fallacy consists in is saying, even if jobs are initially destroyed by changes in technology, in the long term, new jobs will always be created. Now, I would submit to you guys that this time is different. And I'm not alone in saying this. The Bank of England in 2015, Andy Haldane, their chief economist, wrote a paper saying how 15 million jobs are going to disappear in the next 20 years. You had a congressional committee. I think they reported something like 75% of all US jobs earning less than $20 an hour are at high risk of automation. You've got similar things coming out from various bodies aligned to the UN, various entrepreneurs. Recently, I think about 2 years ago, you had a sort of Silicon Valley billionaire who said the first person who's going to be a trillionaire is the person who masters AI. And they're going to be able to, lay off millions of accountants and software people and doctors and anything basically which has to examine data. And it strikes me as utterly bizarre that in our sense of conscious possibility, a trillionaire is more plausible than eliminating homelessness. I mean, isn't that remarkable? Somebody with $1,000 billion is more conceivable than not having somebody freezing to death outside when it's 5 degrees. And this is a sensibility which we call capitalist realism. And that might sound sort of very, pointy head. Capitalist realism, what does it mean? It's to say, in this contemporary imagination we find ourselves in, there's no alternative to capitalism, that the end of the world is more possible than the end of capitalism. The end of the world is more possible than the end of capitalism. That's the kind of imagination that says a trillionaire is more possible than getting rid of homelessness. Even though clearly getting rid of homelessness is far easier. We could do it today. We could have done it 50 years ago, right? So capitalist realism says the end of the world is more possible than the end of capitalism. And we see that replete throughout modern dystopias. I don't know who's fans of film or fiction. Who's seen, for instance, Children of Men? Hands up. It's a very good film. You should watch it. It's by Alfonso Cuarón. He's the director. He directed this new recent Oscar-winning film. And it's basically a parable about the end of the world. And it's a crisis of non-reproduction, but it's not a crisis of non-reproduction because of the end of capitalism, it's a crisis of non-reproduction because of infertility. You have a similar conceit at the heart of The Handmaid's Tale, very similar, it's dystopia. Now, we can imagine a complete transformation of social relations like this, the end of the world, but we can't imagine moving beyond the wage relation. We can't imagine moving beyond a world where people like Jeff Bezos determine the political conversation. There was a great, I don't know if you saw this on Twitter, a video, and Bernie Sanders was asked yesterday, I think by CBS, well, what do you think of Howard Schultz? He says the Democrats shouldn't run a radical, then he won't run as the sort of moderate candidate, the moderate independent. And Bernie Sanders says, why are you even quoting Howard Schultz? Why are all the papers quoting Howard Schultz? Why is Howard Schultz? Why is Howard Schultz's name in every single newspaper and every broadcast TV station? It's because he's a billionaire. There's no other reason. Howard Schultz hasn't got like a PhD in political science. He's not been in public service. He's never been in government. He's a billionaire through selling coffee. How does that make him any more established in determining the best form of government than anybody else? Clearly not true. So that idea of capitalist realism is very, very profoundly important when we try and think of these alternatives, which I'm going to talk about, in terms of breaking with the challenges of automation. Because I've said at the very least it's going to increase income inequality, and it's also going to create this crisis of underconsumption. Automation's one challenge. I'm going to go on to two bigger challenges, far bigger. And people on the right of the Labour Party need to hear how big these challenges are. The first is a crisis of ageing. Now, we don't talk about it enough, but the crisis of ageing is as big as climate change in the next 50 to 100 years. In 1900, 1 in 3 people would live to around 100 years old. By the way, I've got a book coming out that's all cited, right? Today, it's about 1 in 3. And we have, at the same time, simultaneously declining birth rates. We actually don't even have birth replacement rates anymore, 2.2. So we have an ageing population supported by ever fewer young people. Now, that's a major challenge, isn't it? It's a major challenge. And we will be unique in nature as a species by having more old people than having more young people. No other species has that. And that shows how successful we are as a species. But the irony is, we're so successful, we're not going to have a system of social support to look after these old people. Which brings me to the issue of Southampton, which is around local care homes, and it's been a very salient issue locally. This is not a political football. The only sector, bringing this back to automation, which is going to create jobs in the next 50 years is care work. I'm not trying to say that to be woke or to get brownie points. It's true. Industrial manufacturing in the next 50 to 100 years could go the way of agriculture. In the 1700s, around 50% plus of European workers were in agriculture. What's it today? It's about 2%. The United States is the world's largest producer of milk, beef, chicken, wheat. Less than 1% of the American labour market is in agriculture. If you'd said that to the founding fathers, they would have said, that's impossible. Well, by 2050, 2060, maybe only 5% of the labour market will be involved in what we currently view as manufacturing. So where are the jobs going to come from? Well, partly, if we win as socialists, it'll mean we have a shorter working week. It'll mean we can retire at a younger age. But we will see, like I say, growth in certain sectors. Yes, some people will be involved in, solar cell engineer or wind turbine technician, great. But that's not going to be most people. And you often see this kind of strange analysis which comes from neoliberal economists, but even some well-meaning ones, centre-left economists, and they say, well, in the future, people will have very creative jobs, They'll be able to do things, uniquely human things, be creativity, and, Africa's population is going to double between now and 2050. There'll be 10 billion people on this planet around 2100, about 9 billion by the middle of this century. Could be more by the end, obviously, it's difficult to determine and model that far ahead. More than 9 billion by 2050. Do you think when Africa's population is more than doubled, they're all going to be personal trainers, or interior designers, or hairdressers? No. Or Instagram influencers? No, they're not. The backbone of the modern economy, cashier, driver, retail assistant, all of these jobs could become a thing of the past. And if you think I'm just plucking that from my backside, go to YouTube and type in Amazon Go. Amazon have a plan to effectively automate the entire US retail offline industry, right? They bought Whole Foods 2 years ago for about $14 billion US. And they already have the warehousing, they already have a bunch of stuff in their supply chains, so it's just about having a front-facing store rather than a bunch of warehouses. And the plan is, you'll see it's an amazing video. They had a prototype store in Seattle, I think, a year ago, so it works, it's happening. You go in with your phone, you log in, you pick up your stuff, it's all got RFID tags, radio frequency ID tags, you walk out, and you're charged to your phone. That's it. And they plan to have per store 6 people on a roadster at any one time. The average US supermarket right now is about 70 people. When you think about how many people work in retail, West Keys or Gunwharf in Portsmouth, that's a lot of jobs. Same with driving in terms of self-driving cars. We don't know how quickly that's going to roll out because it's a policy issue, it's a negligence and a safety issue. But when people say, oh, well, it'll never be as safe as human driving, 30,000 people die every year from road accidents in the United States. The second you can automate that and only 15,000 people die, there's a counter-argument which says, actually, we have a moral imperative to automate it. It would save lives. How could you drive? You're endangering people's lives. So, slowly but surely, these jobs, like I say, the backbone of the modern economy, they have been for 100 years. Retail assistant, cashier, driver are going to go. And those jobs are going to be created in care. Geriatric care, health care, and, yeah, some childcare. We clearly need to socialise childcare. Now, the issue around geriatric care and health care go hand in hand. If we're going to think about the NHS as a healthcare system for the 21st century, it also will have to be a social care system, right? Now, we often talk about the term exponential. Who here has heard of exponential? Let me try and keep you all awake. Hands up. Yeah? Exponential. It's often used in regards to digital technologies. If you go very exponential, it sounds really great. And it basically means rather than something increasing linearly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the previous number is a function of the one before. So it goes 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, yada, yada, yada. And you apparently have this anecdote from like the 6th century where a guy invents a game, predecessor game of chess, and this emperor says, wow, this is amazing. What do you want as your prize? He puts a grain of rice on the first square and he says, double the number of pieces of rice, or grains of rice per square, and I want the amount of rice that's on that final square. And of course, there's more rice than there are atoms on planet Earth. And that's not an exaggeration, it's a phenomenal number. And he lost his head, apparently, he was beheaded. But the point is exponential growth is a very impressive thing, and it's been the backbone, basically, of what's called Moore's law in computers for decades. So we often think of exponential growth as well, really exciting, really sexy. But it turns out the relationship between terminal illness and age is also exponential, right? So let's say we can sort out coronary heart disease, let's say we can virtually eliminate coronary heart disease and cancer. Would be wonderful. But the reality is, because you're twice as likely at 75 to get Alzheimer's as you are at 70, and then twice as likely again from 75 to 80, and twice as likely again from 85 to 80, you understand there's a trend here, right? And that's not just the case with Alzheimer's, it's with a lot of health conditions. A society where it's increasingly common to live to 70, 80, 90 is going to spend a hell of a lot on healthcare, right? And that crisis is just as profound as the one around automation. I'll get to climate change in a second. But I think people at the level of both local and national politics need to understand this thing about ageing. I'm not saying this as a young person. I'm not young. I'm actually okay. It's the kids coming up now. It's the Gen Zers. They're going to be a really small birth cohort, and they're going to have to be looking after the rest of us. It's really, really crazy. And so we need a political and social settlement paid for by the rich, which is going to make this remotely possible and preferably socially just. So ageing is another one, and it's very intimately connected to automation, because the changes in automation, if we deal with them properly, allow us to address the crisis of ageing as well. Finally, climate change. Now, climate change is huge. Climate change is absolutely, without doubt, in the long term, the medium to long term, the biggest challenge facing humanity. If people say to you, well, we don't know if climate change exists, you can say between the 1870s, and this is all sized in the book, between the 1870s and now, we know the planet's temperatures have increased by about 0.8 to 0.9 degrees centigrade. We know planetary warming has happened. And how that works is you get concentrations of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide in the atmosphere, and they warm the planet up. The thing is, there's a delay. And even by virtue of the carbon dioxide we've already put into the atmosphere, and it has significantly higher concentrations now than it has had for thousands of years, even if tomorrow we decarbonised, there's a lag, which means simply by the fumes that were coming out of people's Fords and Cadillacs and Rovers in the 1950s, that stuff's still going to do its damage on the atmosphere, when my kids were around. So there's that lag. So even if we decarbonise tomorrow, we're going to face runaway climate change in the next century. So like I said, it's already gone up 0.8, 0.9 degrees. Most people now agree it's going to go to 1.5 or 2 degrees, right? Now 2 degrees, what does that do? It does quite a lot. It's not doomsday, but it does quite a lot. It melts glaciers in Central Asia, which currently give fresh water to around 2 billion people. I think 5 of the world's largest rivers in terms of use for drinking water, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, the Yellow River, all these come from glaciers in Central Asia. Basically, most of the drinking water for India and China come from glaciers, which are melting very quickly. It does that. What else does it do? It desertifies far more of Africa than we already have. It desertifies a lot of southern Europe. California, you probably can't really grow many crops there. So 2 degrees already has massive, massive changes on our planet. Massive. But the really worrying thing is if we hit 3 degrees. Because at 3 degrees, you get a sort of a sequence where it goes ever higher. Right? It will get considerably higher. It might cap off at 6, 7 degrees. So let's go through what that sequence might look like. At 3 degrees centigrade, what happens? And this is very well documented in a book called, by Mark Linus, 6 Degrees. And it's widely considered to be a very eloquent and thorough investigation of what runaway climate change looks like. At 3 degrees, the Amazon basin desertifies. That might sound strange, it's obviously a jungle, but if you look at where it is on the equator, perfectly sensible thing to happen. Now, when the Amazon becomes a desert, that has a number of impacts. One is it changes the hydrological cycle, hurricane seasons, etc. But obviously this is a massive sink for carbon dioxide. That disappears, and it means planetary warming goes up another degree. What happens at 4 degrees? There is an amazing amount of permafrost in Siberia, which begins to melt. There is methane hydrate across Siberia, which then gets emitted and goes into the atmosphere. This then pushes us another degree up. At which point, about 4 or 5 degrees, methane hydrate from the oceans starts to come out as well. Because the oceans are so hot, it's released and it goes into the environment. And by the way, the oceans are so hot at that point that they can't really sustain much life beyond jellyfish. And we're already seeing this in terms of the kinds of animals that are thriving in our oceans and seas right now. They look very different to 50, 100 years ago because they're slightly warmer. So at 5 or 6 degrees warmer, what does the planet look like? And this is a perfectly plausible inference from what I've outlined here, right? It's perfectly possible. If we get to 2 or 3, we can get to 5 or 6. A world of 6 degrees warming wouldn't really be able to sustain agriculture beyond the North and South Pole, fundamentally. Sea levels would obviously be far, far, far higher. I mean, we certainly won't be here. But the most worrying thing is that the concentrations of methane in the atmosphere really mean anything with lungs can't breathe. Mammals are going to really struggle. Just like dinosaurs struggled, after the end of the Cretaceous period, mammals are finished. We're finito, because we need lots of oxygen at 6 degrees. Hopefully, however, that's thousands of years in the future. Okay? And ageing, like I've said, is a much bigger social challenge in the short term. But what's incumbent on us, as a generation, is that we can stop the runaway climate change bit. This is really important. Because people will say, oh, well, 1 or 2 degrees, that's sort of priced in. Oh, 2 degrees, that'd be nice. Warmer summers, it's already warm now, isn't it? It's February. Great. We only had winter for 1 month. Fantastic. Are you going to be saying that when there's 500 million climate refugees? Are you saying that when we're going to have to be importing drinking water from independent Scotland and we have resource conflicts with Scots? I don't think that's a particularly good thing to look forward to. So what we can do is decarbonise as quickly as possible and stop that runaway climate change, because the things we're optimistic about is that 2 degrees warming is still very much achievable. Very much achievable. And actually, if you look at the fall in costs of photovoltaic cells, solar cells, wind turbines, batteries, they're all going down really quickly. I'm not a fan of market economics, but they're going down really quickly. The point is we need state intervention, decisive state intervention to say, you know what, this is going to be like our moon landing. We decarbonise the entire economy in 20 years. Yeah, for some things we might need to keep residual nuclear power, etc. Okay, 5-10%. But generally speaking, we can decarbonise the entire economy. So that, along with ageing and automation, are the 3 big things. I'm going to leave it at that, I think. I'll say one final thing, though, because obviously we want practical ideas. And I would say to people who are working in trade unions or organising, that yes, the care sector is going to increase, but also the care sector is going to be a strategic choke point in the economy of 40, 50 years' time. Very, very important strategic sector, much like logistics or distribution now, or like coal mining 30, 40 years ago. It's going to be a very strategically important place to organise. And if we can be one step ahead of capital and say, let's organise care workers, it's also the only growing sector, by the way, that's a smart thing to do, isn't it? Secondly, in terms of who else we should be organising, the whole thing around automation can be overstated. Because, yes, radiologists might be laid off. Yes, paralegals could be laid off because all they're doing is processing huge amounts of information. That can be automated. White-collar workers aren't immune from this. They may think they are, but they're not. But the jobs of fine hand-motor coordination, they're going to stay with us a lot longer, right? And this is something called Moravec's paradox. Moravec's paradox says it's actually harder to create a robot or a machine to do the dishes than it is to beat Garry Kasparov at a game of chess. Now, we've only just sussed this out, right? We always thought the most demanding computational problems you could think of, a game of chess, these ginormous mathematical problems which only a computer could solve, actually, in terms of processing power, that's far easier than a 5-year-old picking up a paperclip and taking it apart. Because the evolutionary biology behind that second bit is hundreds of millions of years old. Whereas the stuff that means we can play chess and do maths is about maximum 500,000, 1 million years old, the neocortex. So actually, the development and the stuff we don't even think about, the stuff when you're driving, you see a cat and you stop, that's the thing which self-driving cars aren't going to be able to do, is actually the most impressive stuff around computing. So what does that mean in terms of the labour market? Well, it means low-skilled work, low wages, low-skilled work, won't be automated for two reasons. One, it'll be very technically difficult, but two, the wages are so low already, where's the incentive? So we should think absolutely about people in the labour market in low-skill, low-wage areas. Garments manufacture. There's a reason if you go to a textiles factory in Bangladesh, it's not automated. It's not automated because the work they're doing, the fine motor coordination they're doing, is far harder to automate than an automotive manufacturer, like a car manufacturer. And also they're very cheap. So these are the two parts of the labour market we should absolutely focus on. What a strange thing to say. Fine motor coordination jobs, a seamstress, somebody involved in washing, a cleaner, very, very hard to automate, and the care sector. That's my 2 bobs worth.
Okay, comrades, if you've got question or contribution for Aaron, and obviously if you can not overdo it, then I'd appreciate that, because there may be a lot of people who want to actually come in and say something. So, any questions? If we do have questions, we might take them in threes, and then Aaron can answer, come back to them on threes. So, Quinn, Hayley, Sarah, that's the first 3. Yeah, can you, because it'll be very difficult, and can you come, sorry, I know this is a bit pedantic, but if you could just line up. And comrades, it's actually really good to actually see the first 3 speakers are women, comrades, so that's a little bit of a breakthrough. Yeah, just come up.
Oh, okay,
come
thanks.
Quick. Tell everybody we can take it in threes.
There we go. I'm just really interested in how you think kind of AI and automation are going to intersect a little bit more, because I think that's so I work in tech and I see a lot of, we're actively pushing and looking for products and that will automate kind of stuff, but then that flows down to retail workers as well. And I'm just wondering how, I'd just like to know more about it, if you see what I mean, and what we on the left can possibly do about it.
Hi, I'm Sarah Bogle, and I'm as a councillor, I'm sitting on something called the Future of Work Scrutiny Inquiry, which is quite relevant to what Erin is talking about. And as part of that, we had a presentation from the Centre for Cities, which talks about which cities are sort of addressing the challenges of the changes, the fourth industrial revolution. And they presented a table which had basically a table of jobs that they think they're going to disappear, jobs that will stay, and jobs that for the future. And it wasn't all as quite as doom and gloom as Aaron has painted it, but so I just wondered if he'd actually seen some of that work and if he had any comments about some of the other jobs that might be created in the future, because we're also looking at things like what skills are needed in our economy and whether Southampton is in a how can we actually help our people in the city actually really benefit from this. It's not all necessarily negative, though we do recognise there isn't going to be a lot of changes in the workplace. So just wanted to get a comment from some of the other evidence and research that's going on out there. Thank you.
Hi there, Aaron. I'm Hayley. I'm from Unison, and just wanted to say thank you for highlighting the Care Homes campaign that Unison and Unite have been running. And actually, we do have a carer from one of the homes here today who joined the Labour Party. So thank you very much. In terms of the question, I'd be interested if you've got a view on how we can potentially use automation in the care sector to bring jobs into the public sector, or actually give some of our carers the means so that they can cut out some of these awful care companies like Allied who go bust and pay people £2.33 an hour, which I've had in Southampton for a living carer. So I'd be really interested in the difficulties that automation might bring, but also how we can harness that and actually get more people with a real living wage and the ability to organise. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Great. So the first one I'll show you is that. Which one is it? Cool. I don't want to break it. Yeah. So, knock myself out. In regards to the relationship between AI and automation, so AI is really interesting, and a lot of people in California, Silicon Valley, are asking questions about sort of ethical dilemmas around it. One they're not asking, unsurprisingly, is implications it would have for the labour market. Because how can you have a fair labour market if some workers can access AI that can do phenomenal things but others can't? That clearly is a skewed labour market. Right now people are told, well, if you have certain skills or certain assets or certain features in the labour market, you'll be remunerated for them. But if, for instance, we have a labour market where somebody's intelligence is augmented to an extent where they render somebody else's intelligence worthless, that clearly has implications for supply and demand on labour markets. That's my really interesting one. The only person who's talked about this is a chap, I don't like to talk about his name, Elon Musk has talked about it. And it's like, for him, it's like an interesting quandary. Isn't that interesting? That wouldn't be a fair labour market, would it? No, it wouldn't. It would mean lots of people wouldn't have the means to live. It's a problem. There's a really good book on this by a chap called Nick Bostrom, Superintelligence. And a lot of the Silicon Valley people are kind of obsessed with it because they've seen, they've watched Terminator and they've seen The Matrix. So they're worried about the idea of an artificial intelligence sort of out of control. And it could create major social problems, but it probably doesn't look like The Matrix. But still, these films like that are good because they provoke and they make us ask serious questions about very real things, which is what artificial intelligence is. The second question about the fourth industrial revolution. So, if you thought I was going OTT, I would say the fourth industrial revolution doesn't even mean anything, right? Because there's a book by McAfee and Brynjolfsson. Who was the lady that asked that question? So I see it. Yeah, there's a great book. It's called The Second Machine Age. So somebody calls it the Second Machine Age. Somebody else calls it the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Somebody else will call it the Third something. Somebody else will call it the First Singularity. Obviously I've got a book to sell, so I've said it's the Third Disruption, right? My editor was like, you have to have numbers and all this stuff. I was like, okay, let's call it the Third Disruption, because for me, the transition we're about to go through is as big as agriculture 12,000 years ago. Not this week, this year, in the next 100 years. So for me, the first transition is agriculture, creates surplus, which is obviously the basis for culture, cities, literature, right? Modern life as we know it. And then 250 years ago, the Industrial Revolution, which again is a game changer. And this planet only gets 1 billion people by 1800. Since then, it's gone to 7.5 billion. Life expectancy has more than doubled. Birth rates have fallen. Literacy has gone from 1 or 2% to nearly 98% in most countries, right? So it was profoundly changed by the Industrial Revolution, by the Agricultural Revolution. By the way, before the Agricultural Revolution, 12,000 years ago, the Earth's human population was 5 million people. It's the population of Ireland across the whole of planet Earth. So these were clearly very big transitions. And I think the transition we're about to go through is what I call a third disruption, because of automation, artificial intelligence, but also move beyond hydrocarbon energies. I'm very optimistic in the long term. I call it that. Now, in terms of the data, and I've got a lot of this, but I didn't have my notes to read from, so obviously you can see why. So in 1970, there were 1,000 industrial robots worldwide. By the beginning of 2016, that number has risen to 1.8 million, and is expected to exceed 3 million by 2020. Since 2010, the global stock of industrial robots has increased by more than 10% a year on average. Compound growth means that trend persisting should mean that manufacturing will stop creating jobs really around now. Now, this isn't new, the idea of automation changing output. If we look at 1983 to 2003, information technology and robotics allowed the US steel industry to increase production, so this is not that recent, 83 to 2003, increase production from 75 million tonnes to 125 million tonnes, while the number of workers involved went from 289,000 to 74,000. So you've got an increase of output there of almost 100%, right? And you're using a third of the workers. And that's not even particularly new technology. So when Donald Trump talks about jabs, they've not gone overseas, they've disappeared as a function of technological change. A different data set, from 1997 to 2005, manufacturing output in the US increased by 60%, while 4 million manufacturing jobs were lost. By 2007, American manufacturers are using more than 6 times as much equipment, including computers and software, as they had done 20 years earlier. So that when people talk about high value-added industry, value-added manufacturing, that literally means you're using less labour to capital. It literally means you have a higher function of capital, fixed capital, to labour. So the value of automotive manufacturing, yeah, it's adding loads of value, but it creates very few jobs, you know? So when we think about high value-added manufacturing, what would that mean? Reshoring, what does that mean? It means that labour is such a small component of overall production costs, it makes sense economically to bring it back from Indonesia or Bangladesh to the UK. So the idea it's going to be a big net job creator is, you know, although how quickly, I agree with you, is an interesting thing, and this is where the next stats come in. Where are we? Let's yeah, that's from the top. Wait a sec, here we go. Yeah. So I told you the Bank of England one, which was 40% of the labour market, 15 jobs. A year later, the bank's governor, Mark Carney, repeated those forecasts. This is Mark Carney saying it. Former Goldman, former Bank of Canada guy as well, saying many livelihoods could be, quote, mercilessly destroyed. Those findings confirmed the conclusions of an earlier report published by 2 Oxford University academics, Carl Benedict Frey and Michael Osborne. In 2013, they asserted that 47% of all US jobs were at high risk of being automated, with a further 19% facing medium risk. Peter Sondergaard, research director for the consultancy Gartner, claimed that by 2025, 1 in 3 jobs will be automated as a result of an emerging, quote, superclass of technologies, with general purpose robotics and once more machine learning leading the way. Finally, and I already hinted on this, in a 2016 report to Congress, White House economists forecast an 83% chance, higher than I said, that workers earning less than $20 an hour will lose their jobs to robots in the medium term. So they could be wrong, but these aren't sort of frivolous outlier voices. White House, Congress, Bank of England, the Sondergaard Group, who else was there? Peter Sondergaard, rather, at Gartner, and 2 Oxford academics. So these are very much mainstream ideas to engage with. Could be wrong. I mean, in a way, touch wood. In a way, no, because we'd like to have the benefit of that, you know, redound to emancipating labour. But the data so far, you'd be right to say, is counterintuitive, because we have the highest rates of employment ever. But that's in very strange places. And actually, if you look at the jobs, the majority of people going into jobs in the last 5 years have actually been older workers, which is really strange. So the idea of old people are flooding back into the labour market, it tends to be older people who have to get the work. The idea that this is new jobs being created for people who are otherwise young people just sitting on their hands isn't necessarily true. And again, another thing is, a lot of those jobs are being created in London. So if you're young and you live in the North East or in North Wales or the South West, those jobs probably aren't there. Yeah.
So anyone that puts their hands up, just wait for you to kind of line up. Whoever gets there first gets the first question.
Oh no.
Steve Chivers. Hi. Not too close. Yeah, you talked about automation, right? And how it affects the labour market. It's going to decrease the labour market. What I was thinking about was, how do you see it affecting the education and colleges and young people coming through in the early parts of their careers? So what jobs are they going to actually go for? And are we going to actually find a situation where you haven't got enough jobs for the people that they're trying to train for? And how's that going to affect the economy? Because you end up with a lot of people unemployed, I would have thought. So I'd like your views on that, please.
Here's a song.
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Aaron. I think everything you've said tonight has been absolutely correct on the way that we have to kind of focus on these things of automation and climate change. And my question really comes in two parts. The first part was actually linked to the last one, where it comes to those new jobs, where are we going to find them? And I think that kind of lies in the fact that if you're going to, say if you've got a car manufacturing plant and you've automated it, you've got robots doing it, well, maybe you could start having jobs where you've now got to employ people to maintain the automated robots and things like that. And I think another thing we've got to be careful of is, because automation can be both a blessing and a curse, really. And I say a curse because what happens because we can, as you were saying, we can now make things cheaper and faster with less workers, could that accidentally lead to a kind of like crisis of overproduction, where suddenly the market's just flooded with all these raw materials and new products, and then the consumer demand goes down? How could that affect the economy as well?
Ashley?
Right, I found this really quite fascinating, and it's a great way of us getting together on an evening, isn't it, to get to the real issues in society. What it's shown to me is that we really need to value our carers as our kind of number one resource in this country, because that carer may well be the person that's going to be looking after you or your loved ones. So make sure they're decently paid, really well paid, so you get the very best. Just thinking about the health service, it seems to me as though the health service is great on the high-tech side, but they're being going on the route of privatisation, particularly of the care side of the National Health Service, not high-tech. And it seems to me we need in-house cleaners, lots of cleaners, so that we can abolish the prospect of getting bugs when you're in hospital, because it's been done the cheap. Secondly, we need more nursing assistants, so that things like bed sores, which people are getting because the nurses are so stretched doing the high-tech stuff, we need more staff in there to make sure that the people are not getting avoidable things like bed sores. And finally, basic things. We need people in there to encourage patients to eat their food so they can get strong, so they can get into community care and get out and live in a decent life. So I've got to say, it's really inspiring, and I think we should go out and say we need a different and a better workforce that serves all our interests, not some skewed, privatised, mad thing that we're importing from the US. Thank you.
We may as well take you, Emily, because you're the only one that's syndicated so far. So we can take you, Emily, and then Alan can come back. Yeah?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you where you think either universal basic income or universal basic services would come into this, and which one you think is likely to be more beneficial for people in the long term.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask.
Yay!
So the thing about jobs and kids going to university, here's an article on cnbc.com from the 21st of February. Wow, that's yeah, Euro wow. Mark Cuban, who's a billionaire, he owns the Dallas Mavericks. It's a basketball team. He's a bit of a character. He's involved in the US version of Dragon's Den. Says studying philosophy may soon be worth more than computer science. Here's why. So you should check that out. And he basically says, I mean, it's just these mad things they say, right?